Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to another video tutorial. My name's Jonathan Lampel, and in this video we're going to be taking a look at how to create this procedural, super awesome grunge shader inside of cycles. So this is super cool because you can use it pretty much on any object, and it automatically generates these areas where it's scratched, and also in the crevices where there's a little bit of dirt built up, and it's completely customizable. And so without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So I'm just going to take all of this hard work and delete it. Okay, so we're starting completely fresh. First I'm going to start on this monkey and on this box over here, and then stress test it on this Lamborghini model. So I'll go over to just this layer and focus on the monkey for now. So first of all, I'm not even going to add any shader. First I'm going to start out with the texture, and I'm going to use a wave texture, and this is going to be the foundation of our dirt texture. So we're going to create a dirt texture first, and then we're going to create a scratched texture, and then we're going to combine those two with the pointiness node and a few color ramps to really define where we want those crevices and areas where it's been brushed up against and scratched to be. So let's go ahead and start with that wave texture. I'll move over here so we have a bunch of working area, add texture and wave, and I can use Control Shift if you're using the Node Wrangler add-on. Maybe it's in by default, I'm not sure, but you can always use that in File User Preferences and look for Node Wrangler. So I can press Control Shift and automatically look, and it attaches a viewer, so I can just see the texture right away without having to bother with any shaders. So this wave texture, I'm going to scale it down to 1, and I'm going to change the distortion to 150. So it's going to be extremely distorted, and I'm going to turn the detail up to 15. So this is interesting, but we're not actually going to use this texture by itself. We're going to use it to drive another texture, and black and white areas are going to tell another texture, which in this case is going to be a Voronoi texture. So let's go ahead and add that in. And maybe drive was the wrong word because it's not using a driver, but it's going to be plugged into the vector, and it's going to tell this where to be placed. So instead of being a normal texture coordinate, it's using the black and white values of this wave, and it's going to stretch out this Voronoi texture along that same pattern. And this gives us a really cool natural looking effect. So I'm going to set the scale to about 4, so it's a bit bigger, but I want the scale of all of these things to be in relation to the object and not the world. So what I'm going to do is just add an input and texture coordinate and plug in object to this first vector here. So that way no matter what object I apply it to, it can always be the same size as long as their scale is applied. So let's go ahead and create a few more layers of dirt, because you never want to use just one texture, usually 3 or more layered on top of each other to give us the most amount of detail possible. So we're going to go a slightly different path. In this one we're going to use a Musgrave texture. So let's go add that in, Musgrave. I can use object as the vector, just like before. So I can use Control Shift and click and look at the output here. But this one's going to be interesting because I'm going to turn the scale down to 1, so it's going to be very, very large. It's kind of weird how when you turn the scale down it gets bigger, but that's the way it is, I suppose. And I'm going to turn the detail up to 3, which you're going to see makes these edges a little bit more crisp, and it's going to be more bright in the center. But I'm going to turn the dimension all the way down to 0. And it doesn't make any difference now, but when we turn the linearity up to, say, 15, now we have a whole bunch of detail inside that detail. If I had a higher dimension, all that is going to go away. So I need to turn that to 0 and then turn the linearity up, and now we have a pretty good looking layer of grunge. Let's go ahead and do this one more time to get a different scale, different size details. So I'm going to Shift D, duplicate that down, and instead of scaled to 1, I'm going to scale this to 25. Control Shift to view it. And everything else I'm going to leave the same, and of course plug in this object coordinate right there. So already we have 3 layers of detail that we can combine together. So before we add another layer, let's go ahead and just combine what we already have. So I'm going to press Shift A, add color mix RGB, So I can plug these two in together, but I don't want to mix them half and half really. I want to sort of layer them on top of each other. But in this case, since the white places are going to define where our grunge is, and the black is going to be where our grunge is not, I actually want it to be a little bit more brighter than darker. So I'm going to use lighten, turn the factor up to 1, and now you can see we have both details laid on top of each other, but the second texture of Musgrave is lightening the other one up. So we're going to do that one more time with this other layer, Shift D. I can plug this in here. So you can see it's lighting up some of these areas as well where this texture is white. And now we're going to add one more layer of detail. So this one's going to be pretty much the opposite of this one here. So let's duplicate this down. But instead of the wave texture driving the Voronoi texture, I'm going to switch it up, and now the Voronoi is going to transform the wave. So if we plug in our object coordinate here, and look at this Voronoi texture, but I want to scale it up really big, say to 30, so that now when we look at this, we have a whole bunch of very small dots. But instead of plugging this into the vector, I'm actually going to plug it into the scale. So this texture is going to determine the scale of this wave texture, and now we get this really interesting dot pattern. Almost looks like a whole bunch of little amoebas or microorganisms or something. I'm going to turn the distortion down to 0 and turn the detail down to 2. So now we have these really interesting dots. Now we can combine these. But now that if I do that, it's really going to wash everything out, and it's a little bit too light. So instead of lightening it up or adding it, I'm actually going to overlay it. So the white areas will lighten and the dark areas will darken with this overlay option. And there we go. So now with all of these layers, we're getting some really good detail, but these little dots are a little bit overbearing, I think. So I'm going to turn the factor down to about 0.3. So there we have it. We have our grunge map. So now let's go ahead and tell Blender where that grunge map should be placed. So we're going to use a input and geometry node, and we're going to use this pointiness value down here. So this pointiness is essentially a cavity mask, but it's a little bit different, and it's called pointiness just because it's sort of the opposite of cavity mask, but that's alright. We can still use it in the exact same way as we would normally. So let's go ahead and add a color ramp. So Shift A, converter, and color ramp. So when we plug this in and take a look at it with Control Shift and click, you can see that this is what the pointiness node normally looks like. But we can take the ends of this color ramp and sort of squish them in, and it's going to add some contrast and really clearly show those shapes. So right now, with the white on the right and the black on the left, it's going to mask out the areas that we actually want the grunge to be in. So let's use this flip button and just flip the color ramp around, and now we have it exactly as we'd like. I like to turn this to linear, or excuse me, from linear to ease, just to get a little better gradation, and you can play around with this. So everywhere where there's white is where our dirt is going to be. So I don't want too much, but just enough. I'd say that looks pretty good. And then you can use this white to bring up the contrast. So that's looking good. So now I can take that, and if I use a mix RGB again, I can now multiply these two values with a factor of 1, and there we go. We now have our grunge mask for our dirt. So this is really cool, and it's completely controlled by this color ramp here. You can change those values to whatever you'd like. So remember, the white means that we are going to have dirt there, and black means that we are not. And the reason I used multiply here is because when you multiply any number by 0, which black in this case represents 0, it's always going to be 0. So anywhere that's black in this image or this image, the resulting color is going to be black. and any color that's white, which represents 1, anything multiplied by 1 is the same as itself, and so those areas are going to stay the same. So that's a really good way to darken things up. So now that we have that, let's go ahead and add our scratch procedural texture. And this one looks really big, but it's actually not too hard to create. So we're going to start with a wave texture. Wave texture, and I'm going to, let's see, duplicate this texture coordinate, pull it up here just so we have a little bit more room. And this takes up a lot of space, so I'm going to pull it up a bit more and plug in the object coordinate here. And now we can take a look. So when you think about scratches, it's basically a whole bunch of little lines going in different directions, right? So the way that made sense to me is the wave texture is a whole bunch of lines, so now let's have a lot of them going in different directions, right? Makes sense. So let's start out with this texture here. I'm going to scale this up to 25, and that way we get some really small lines. Some of these are sort of stretched out, and you can UV them if you'd like, but for me I think it looks just fine, since we're going to have a few of these. But they're a bit too thick, I think, so I'm going to use a brightness contrast, so color bright contrast. And now I'm going to use a brightness of 1, which is going to lighten everything quite a bit, but then a contrast of 2, and so it'll bring those lines down a little bit. So it's just really thinning out those lines is essentially what this brightness contrast does, and gets rid of the gradation in between them. So this is a good start. Let's shift select these, Shift D to duplicate them down, plug in that object coordinate, and this one is going to be exactly the same as the last one, with one difference. I'm going to move these both down a bit more. This one I need to rotate around a bit. So we don't want all the scratches going in the same direction, right? So let's use a mapping node, vector and mapping, and just rotate this 90 degrees on the x-axis. So now it's facing the completely opposite direction. But of course we don't want these textures to be everywhere. We want them to sort of be all patchy, right? So let's use a noise texture to make that happen. So let's add texture and noise texture. Plug in the same object coordinate. And if we take a look at this, we can see how big that is. Let's set the scale to 15. So it's fairly small. And we'll leave the detail at 2. So now we can use a color and mix RGB. But of course we don't really want to mix them together. We want to take this noise texture and wash out some of these white areas so that there are no black lines. So let's use a add, and so that's doing it quite nicely. However, it's sort of, not as contrasty as we'd like. So easy enough, let's just duplicate this brightness contrast right up. But instead of a brightness of 1 and a contrast of 2, I'm going to turn this up to 10, so we have quite a lot of contrast. And that might create some problems down the line, so let's go ahead and clamp this here to keep those values between 0 and 1. And now we have some nice scratches. I'm going to do the same down here, so I can Shift D, duplicate those down. Plug in that object coordinate. Actually, we can use this same coordinate so that the noise texture is not the same. That'll help give us some nice variation. And we can duplicate this add down here. And there we go. We have a different set of scratches. Let's go ahead and create 2 more sets of scratches just to give us a lot of variation. The more variation, the more realistic it's going to be in the long run. So it's always good to do. Let's make sure we have enough space. Looks like we need to press B to box select these and move them down a bit. So we can just take these right here, Shift D, duplicate them down, plug in the same object coordinate, but instead of rotating these on the x-axis 90 degrees, let's have them be rotated in the y direction 45 degrees. So the reason I'm not doing 90 degrees is because we don't want to have a whole bunch of parallel and intersecting lines. We want them to be sort of offset so they're not at 90-degree angles from each other, which might look a little bit weird. and sort of like a weave pattern, and we want them to look more natural. So I'm going to offset these by 45 degrees, and we can take a look through here. So that's good, but I'm going to change the scale a little bit. I'm going to change them from 25 all the way to 50. So these are going to be very small, and I'm also going to change the noise texture from 15 to 25. So we're going to have a lot more of these small scratches. So that's looking good. Now we can take this and Shift-D duplicate that down one last time. So you can see creating this is pretty fast, but it does take quite a lot of room. This is where node groups might come in handy for you. And I'll just take this Y value, turn that back to 0, and rotate it 45 degrees on the Z-axis. And there we're good to go. So let's go ahead and start combining these three together, or these four together. And we're going to do that by simply multiplying them together. So remember that white is 1, black is 0. Anything that's white is going to stay the same. Anything that's black is going to be black. Change that to multiply, and we take a look. Now we have both sets of scratches laid on top of each other, which is exactly what we want. We can do that down here. Multiply these two together. And lastly, multiply these two sets together. So now we have a really cool scratched texture, and you can change the size of these scratches by changing the size of the noise texture, or make them a bit thicker by changing the size of the wave texture, really whatever you'd like. The last thing we need to do is actually to invert this, because we want the white to say where our scratches are and the black to say where our scratches are not, and right now that's flipped. So let's just go color and invert, stick that in, and there we go, we have a nice texture there. Now I'm going to take this, actually take all of these nodes, zoom way out, move them over a bit, so I can take our material output, put them over here, and drag this invert value down so we don't have to keep going all the way up there. Now I can Shift-D to duplicate this color ramp, plug this in, and this is going to be all of the areas where this material might have been brushed up against or knocked around a bit. Pretty much anything that's on the outside and not in a concave face. And so this is where the scratches might appear logically. So let's go ahead and take this and flip it around, and there we go. Now we might not want scratches everywhere, we might want it on just the edges. So let's take this black back a bit. Actually wanted to take it up a bit, my bad. Say about there, so it's only going to be scratched around those edges. And if we want there to be more contrast, we can take this white and sort of pull it back in. So there we go. So just like before, we can take these two values and multiply them together. So I'm using Shift-D to duplicate the same node that we used down here. And there we have our factor for our scratches. Here we have a scratch, or our factor for our dirt. And now we can use those to mix any shaders that we want. So this is super cool. Let's go ahead and quickly add in those shaders. So I'm going to add a shader, mix shader, shader diffuse. So let's just say our normal material is a super boring gray. So we can take a look at it, shift click. So that's normal. We can Shift-D to duplicate that down. I'm going to make this a dark brown with a roughness of 1. So this is going to be our dirt. And then we can plug that into the mix shader. And now it's a 50% mixture of both. Let's pull these down a bit so we can plug in this dirt factor right here. But as you can see, it's not really showing up a whole lot, even though if we Control-Shift-Click on this, we can see it very clearly. And the reason for that is we actually need to use another color ramp. So let's go Converter and Color Ramp. And we need to take these whites and really wash things out a bit, because it's only going to be completely brown where it's pure white, and now it's sort of a muddled gray. So let's just take this and squish it down. And now when we look through this, we now have some dirt. So this is going to help determine how sort of soft that transition is. So let's do something that looks pretty good, about there. And I'll take this down just a touch. Okay, so there we have our procedural dirt. It's looking really good. Let's go ahead and add those scratches really quick. So let's press Shift D, duplicate that over. And instead of a diffuse node, I'm going to use a glossy. So Shift A, shader, and glossy. So that's cool, and we can plug in this multiply value. But of course we also need this color ramp here as well. And we can take a look. Alright, now when we view through this, we now have scratches on those outside areas, dirt on the inside areas, and everywhere else we have this normal texture, or normal shader. So this is really cool, a super nice shader that really comes in handy sometimes. So that's pretty much it. Let's try to do this for our Lamborghini material real quick. It has the same material applied. So this is just seeing how we can easily change these values here. So it looks like it's not really scratched up quite enough. So let's go ahead and take this scratch mask here for this color ramp and just sort of take this black down just a touch. Something like that. Unfortunately, there's no map value node, which would really come in handy here. There is one in the compositor, but unfortunately not in cycles. So now when we take a look at this, we have a little bit more scratches going around, maybe a bit too much. There we go. So now we might have some coming out on the wheels there. And I think you get the idea. We can easily change this texture to be any size we want, especially since we're using these mapping values right there. And so there you have it. You have a procedural grunge shader that you can use with literally any object, and it'll work right out of the box. So thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.